Our sessions starting from next week would focus on the practical aspect of its actual process of trying to understand a biblical passage. We will try to follow a genre-based approach, as you can see on the course syllabus, and we will talk about best practices, what to keep in mind, and things like that. So now is really a good time to catch up on the theoretical aspect if you haven't already done so. As you remember, we've started by defining what hermeneutics is, its relevance. We've tried to see a very nuanced, a very generalized history of interpretation in which we tried to understand how the people of God tried to understand the scriptures before us and how those practices still affect us in a way. So these past discussions, these past couple of weeks, they're all important when we actually start to read a biblical passage and try to exegete it. So I encourage you to read the assigned materials if you haven't done so. As I've said, I believe we're halfway through the semester, so it really is important that you are doing that. Moreover, I also believe that you've at least started reading the Epistle to the Hebrews, because your exegetical paper will be based on that. So it's important that you make yourself familiar with the epistle as a whole and with the exegetical unit that you are interested in. So I encourage you to read. I also encourage you to read the sample exegetical papers that I've copied in the shared folder. Go check them out and see what an exegetical paper is like. We will discuss about the steps. We will talk about some of them today and the rest tomorrow. So starting from next week, you should start working on the exegetical paper. You should actually start writing the paper. So do that. The workbook lesson report, they are the practical aspect of the assignment of the genre-based approach we will follow, and I will let you know when to submit that. It's actually on the syllabus, and you will see. For example, the first one to be submitted is going to be on the 24th of November. That would be right after we discuss how to understand the Old Testament narrative. And so you have some time for that actually. Just focus on reading and thinking about the exegetical paper. As I've already said, I'm available if there are issues, if you have concerns, feel free to send me an email. I'll get back to you. And if it's important and if it's necessary, we can also make an appointment for a virtual office hour to discuss about the course. If the course is confusing you and if you're not really following the material, if you're having difficulty understanding the essence of the course, we can try to work through some of the issues individually. So if you have that kind of issue, feel free to send me an email and we will do something about that. Okay. So let's start by revising what we've discussed last week. Not only last week, but so far in semester. What do you remember? What is the cumulative arguments that we are trying to build? What do you remember from our discussion so far? And what have you learned so far? Let's start from what we've discussed last week, and I will tell you how that fits with the overall purpose of the course. Anyone? It will be nice if someone can turn on their video. All of you have turned it off, and if you are in a comfortable place, should be actually, but those of you who can do that, so that can make it resemble a physical classroom as much as possible. Okay. No one? Okay. I believe we've talked about text-centered approach, right? We started the course by talking about the three major approaches to hermeneutics. We mentioned that there are scholars who emphasize the author-based approach that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, and there are those that emphasize the text-centered approach, and there are those that focus on reader-centered approach. We will talk about reader-centered approach today. Last week, I believe we talked about text-centered approach. We said that it is a hermeneutical approach in which meaning is believed to reside in the text itself. So the locus of meaning, that is a place where text is located, is the actual text itself. So this approach focuses on trying to understand the structure of the text, the genre of the text, and it's not that much interested in trying to go back to the author's world, trying to go back to the author's intention, and trying to understand the authorial meaning. Rather than saying authorial meaning, these approaches prefer to say textual meaning. And I believe that the text is an autonomous being that can be treated separately from the author. So these approaches, we discussed that in a way as a reaction to the author-centered approach, in which methods like source criticism, textual criticism, overemphasized the history of the text itself, and they overemphasized the world of the author. So those approaches had a tendency to go back to the world of the author and spend a lot of time trying to understand the author's intention, and they assumed that, in fact, that authorial intention was recoverable. But text-centered approaches reacted against that kind of approach. They critiqued that historical approach, the author-centered approach. They had a tendency to fragment the text. They had a tendency to deny the unity of the final version. So text-centered approach reacted against that. They emphasized the unity of the text. They had no intention in trying to, for example, discover the sources behind the text, just like what source criticism tried to do. They rather were satisfied with the final version of the text as we have it. So rather than trying to go behind the text, they invested their time, their energy in trying to understand how the text works, how the structure of the text works, how the literary style of the author and the mode of communication matters. So we call those approaches broadly text-centered approach. And there are a variety of text-centered approach. For example, there is what we call narrative criticism, in which biblical narratives, both Old Testament and New Testament narratives, are studied in narrative critics, takes the text as a whole, and they try to see how characterization works, how the author characterizes, how the dynamics of the text work, how the characters work, where the climax leads to, what the plot of a story is, and things like that. And we also talked about rhetorical criticism, right? Where the focus is not on single individual phrases or individual words, rather the focus is on the cumulative persuasive force of the text itself. So this kind of approach, like rhetorical criticism, narrative criticism, genre criticism, we call them text-centered approaches, just like we called approaches like source criticism, form criticism, author-centered approaches. So this was pretty much what we discussed last week. As I've said, the approach we're taking is that the exegetical steps we will follow starting from next week. We'll try to integrate both author-centered approach, both the author-centered approach and text-centered approach, and it will also include what we will discuss today, which is what we call reader-centered approach ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ሶፋር እየተነጋገርን ያለ ነው ሄርሜቲክስ በአጠቃላይ ለሄርሜቲክስ ያሉ አፕሮቾችን ብሮድሊ በሶስት ልንከፍላቸው እንችላለን። ለስነ አፈታት ማለት ነው። አንዳንዶች በጸሐፊው ዓለም ላይና በጸሐፊው ላይ ፎከስ የሚያደርጉ ሜተዶች አሉ። አንዳንዶቹ ደግሞ በጽሁፉና በጽሁፉ ዓለም ላይ ፎከስ የሚያደርጉ ሜተዶች አሉ። እነሱን እያየን ነበር ዚስ ፓስት ዊክስ። አንዳንዶች ደግሞ ዛሬ እንደምናየው ደግሞ በአንባቢው ላይ ፎከስ የሚያደርጉ አሉ። ሚኒንግ ለሚኒንግ ፎርሜሽን አንባቢውም ኢምፖርታንት ነው ብለው የሚያስቡ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እነዚህ ዲፔንዲንግ ኦን the book you're reading, depending on the scholar, አንዳንዶች ኦቨር ኤምፋሳይዝ ያደርጋሉ አንዱን ሜተድ ፒውርሊ ኦተር ሴንተርድ የሆኑ አፕሮቾችን የሚጠቀማሉ። አንዳንዶች ደግሞ ፒውርሊ ቴክስቱን እንደ ሊትራሪ አውትፑት ብቻ ቴክስቱን እንደ ሊትሬቸር ብቻ በማየት ሊትራሪ የሆነውን ሜተድ የሚከተሉ አሉ። እኛም ፎሎ የምናደርገው ስቴፕ የሚሆነው ሶስቱንም የማከለ ከሶስቱም የሆኑ ነገሮችን የሚወስድ ነው የሚሆነው። ግን in principle it is good to understand that there are these three major approaches ማለት ነው። ዛሬ ሪደር ሴንተርድ ነው ደግሞ አፕሮች እና ያለን በተወሰነ መልኩ ማለት ነው። ጉድ ስለዚህ ለኦተር ሴንተርድ አፕሮች አሳይንድ የሆኑትን ሪዲንጎች ከዛ ለቴክስት ሴንተርድ የሆኑ አሳይንድ የሆነውን ሪዲንግ እና ለሪደር ሴንተርድ የሆነውን አፕሮች እነሱን አንብቧቸው እስከ ኔክስት ዊክ ድረስ ካላነበባችኋቸው ኢምፖርታንት ስለሆኑ ማለት ነው። So let's go to reader-centered approach. በዲቴይል ማንገባው ያንዳንዱ አፕሮች ላይ እነሱን ደግሞ በበለጠ ኤክስፕሎር ስለምታደርጓቸው ነው። አድቫንስድ የሆነ ሄርሜቲክስ ኮርስ ተወስዶ አድቫንስድ ሄርሜቲክ ኮርስ ተወስዶ you will explore each separately. You will explore the philosophical underpinnings behind each approach. You will ask the difficult questions and you will also study the methods in much detail. The methods we mentioned, like source criticism, like rhetorical criticism, and things like that. You will actually, I believe, you will study them, and you will see how it works, and you might even try to employ them. So just know that they exist for now, and you will explore them more as you progress in your studies ማለት ነው። Okay, reader-centered hermeneutics. The name itself gives its main supposition, its main belief. Reader-centered hermeneutics, unlike author-centered and text-centered hermeneutics, lies its emphasis on the reader. Just as the author's world is important to understand the text, just like the author's language, the author's ideology, the author's assumptions, the author's theological convictions, the author's world is important to understand the text is written. It's equally important that the readers, it's equally important to understand the reader's world, the reader's assumption, the reader's presuppositions, and all that. This is the basic assumption of the basic condition of reader-centered hermeneutics. We can only understand another person's discourse in the world we know. Just like we said that the author in a vacuum, it's important that we realize that we, the readers, we also don't live in a vacuum. We also have We also have our assumptions. We also have our worldview. Every one of us has a separate set of glasses that we wear, so to say, that affects the way we read biblical text, that affects the way we listen to any form of communication, in fact. So reader-centered approach try to understand the author, the reader, and they try to highlight the presuppositions, the assumptions of the reader ማለት ነው. So it's always important to know that we are not mere recipients of what's being communicated. It's good to know that whatever information we are reading, whatever information we are listening to, it's important that it undergoes a form of interpretation in our minds, in our world. So it's as if we are not mere blank papers in which something is written or copied down to us directly. There is always an interpretation that happens in the reader ማለት ነው. So just like the author is important to understand the text, that is the author's world and the author's assumptions, as the author's cultural conventions and all, and just like the text structure, the text style, and the mode of communication is important, it's equally important to understand the reader's assumption. That is, it's important to know our presuppositions, to know where we are standing from. It's good to know what kind of glasses we are wearing. It's important to know the perspective we're approaching from. Think of, for example, if you have red glasses on, and if you're asked to describe something you're saying, you will explain it in a way that gives account to the fact that your glasses are red, right? You won't say everything is red. You rather will readjust your vision and try to describe what you see in light of the fact that you are seeing it through a red lens. So it's important to understand where we're coming from. It's important to understand where we're standing from when we read a text ማለት ነው. This is evident not only when we read the Bible, but in every kind of communication. As we discussed in our first class, reading the Bible is a form of communication. It is an act of communication. We are trying to communicate with the Bible as a source. We are at the receiver end of that communication. So think of any communication you have and see how you filter it down. See how you shape it with your own presuppositions. For example, think of a day you, for example, are obsessed with your health. For example, there are days like that, right, where we wake up and we become burdened about our health, or, for example, we become burdened about our heart, for example. So if that concern will shape how you approach everything that day. Not only that, you may be inclined to listen to everything in light of that. So if you are obsessed about something, we have a tendency to understand everything else in light of our obsession. For example, a person who is hungry is more apt to more vulnerable to smell, right? A person, for example, who has to go to the restroom, for example, that is, who has to pee, for example, is susceptible to the sound of water or the sound of rain, things like that, right? Our obsessions, where our mind is, affects how we receive information. So the same is true when we read the Bible as well. It matters how we read the Bible. It matters the posture we bring to the table. So a person who is obsessed, for example, who is obsessed about his salvation, for example, has a tendency to read that obsession into everything. For example, a person who has for example, a person who is trying to listen to God about something, for example, a person who is trying to discover the will of God for something, for example, has a tendency to read every passage in light of that, right? I believe most of us have been there, right? There are times when we become desperate to listen to God's voice, right? There are times when we eagerly try to hear the word of God for our life, for our daily lives, and when we are those kind of phases, for example, we have a tendency to make everything about us. For example, we will try and read what we want to hear from the text, right? So the reader is an active participant. The reader is not a mere recipient. We're not like an empty barrel in which an information simply falls into us. That's not how it works. We in fact participate in the flow of the text. That's why, for example, we have a variety of different interpretations in the world today, in the church, in our church, even in our denominations. So it's important to understand that we have something to bring to the table. We are not mere recipients of information ማለት ነው. So this is what reader-centered hermeneutics tries to advocate for. Of course, reader-centered hermeneutics in and of itself is like a spectrum. It's not one thing. We are in a way generalizing it when we say something like this is what reader-centered hermeneutics. It's like a spectrum. There are who follow a very radical approach to reader-centered hermeneutics, and there are uh, those who want to, for example, just like we're trying to do, to integrate it to our other methods as well. So this is the concern of reader-centered hermeneutics. For example, think of passage I've given you to exegete, that is Hebrews 12. So, for example, as I've said last week or the week before, our passage of interest talks about the discipline of God, right? How God disciplines us, how God disciplines like a father disciplines his son. So, a father that is a married man with a son or with a daughter will necessarily have a different take on the text. I mean, a certain aspect of it will resound more to that person because he actually is a father and he actually have a son. But a single man might miss some of the things that the father notices. So our current situation, the situation we read the text in, matters. We can't simply ignore it ማለት ነው. For example, there are texts in which, for example, think of texts like texts in the New Testament that talk about the role of women in ministry, the role of women in church. A man will have a different perspective on those texts than a woman. A woman, there is a good chance a woman reading that will be more both emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually be involved in that text way more than a man can be involved in that text, for example. So it matters. The reader matters. As I've said, the way we read text is shaped by a wide variety of influences, and every person is shaped by a different set of circumstances. For example, I don't know if you've heard, but there are, for example, some Christians who struggle with the idea of God's fatherhood, right? So the reason that some people struggle with God's idea of fatherhood is that and their relationship with their fathers was not something to be idealized. A father figure for them was not a good thing. Hence, they struggle to see God as a father. They prefer other metaphors rather than a father. So their experiences, the trauma they went through as a child, it affects the way they read those texts today, ማለት ነው. And the same is true. The same is true in many other cases as well. For example, think of think of Muslims, for example. There is, for example, a very lively debate in the world of biblical translation, in which they try to figure out how to translate the phrase "Son of God" in Arabic translations, because the idea of having the idea of God having a son is very taboo. It's part of it's very it's a very weighty matter in the Arabic world. For us Ethiopians, it's not that difficult, but for them, Islam itself polemically teaches that God cannot have a son, right? So people, for example, biblical translators, they have this discussion: is it really better to translate the idea of God's son? Because when we say God has a son, when we Christians say Jesus is the Son of God, we're not talking about biologically, right? We are talking about a functional sonship, in which we claim that Jesus has a very unique relationship with God that can best be described as a relation between a father and a son. So, but this idea is so out of touch, so radical in the Islamic world, that biblical translators consider using another phrase that can convey the same thing. So the cultural matrix readers live in, the cultural matrix we live in, matters in the way we understand texts ማለት ነው. Hence, this is the main concern of reader-centered approaches ማለት ነው. The reader is not a passive spectator in the making of meaning. So when we talk about spectators, we're talking about a football game, right, or something athletic. So when we read, we're not being like the spectators cheering on or something like that. That's not what's going to happen. We actually participate in the game itself. We're part of the process that gives us meaning ማለት ነው. So meaning, readers matter for meaning ማለት ነው. Hence, these observations, they lead us to ask some difficult questions. Some of them are we will shelf them for your course on advanced hermeneutics, but there are, as I've already said, there are some scholars who take this to the radical conclusion of it. That is, some claim that meaning really does not exist without the reader. Some claim that it's really wrong to treat meaning as something to be discovered or something to be exegeted out. They, in fact, see it as a process. They prefer to say meaning is formed, meaning is a process, rather than saying meaning is somewhere in the text or somewhere in the author's world and we need to discover it. They prefer to talk about forming meaning and all that, but shelf these questions for your advanced studies on this issue ማለት ነው. A very important element in this approach is what we call presuppositions. Readers, we have presuppositions. Presuppositions are a priori beliefs. They are some things we take for granted. There are some things we don't even try to interrogate. They are like axioms. We take them to be true and we don't really even question them. So everyone has its own presuppositions. Our presuppositions are our beliefs. They are embedded in us and we take them to be true, and we don't really even try to investigate some. For example, there are some things we believe, but that we are still open to investigate, right? For example, think of the letter to the Hebrews, because your assignment is going to be on that. For example, think of the authorship of Hebrews. The authorship of Hebrews is a controversial thing, and you might believe, for example, that Paul wrote Hebrews. but you are still open to examine that claim. You are open to listen to evidence that can convince you otherwise. But think of the belief that, for example, that your name is Kali. For example, if your name is Ababa, and you've always believed that your name is Ababa, you're not looking for new information to investigate that claim. That's just a presupposition. That just goes without saying, right? And the same is true when it comes to presuppositions as well. We have a variety of beliefs that we are not even conscious of, that we take them to be true and that we take them for granted, for example. Hence, those presuppositions, they affect, they shape the way we read texts. They shape the way, for example, we approach texts ማለት ነው. So these presuppositions can be social presuppositions, they can be ideological, sometimes they can be theological, but they matter, and we have those presuppositions. Hence, in exegesis and in hermeneutics, it's important to be as conscious as possible of these presuppositions. For example, try to understand what's my presupposition when it comes to a certain issue, for example. What is it that I take it for granted that is true? For example, most of us, the existence of God is a presupposition, right? Hence, when we read texts, for example, we read that in light of that presupposition. Hence, an atheist will have a different understanding of, for example, a certain text because of that presupposition. Hence, it's good to understand our presuppositions. It's like understanding the kind of glass that we are wearing. If you are wearing a red glass, you will see everything in that color gradient, right? If you are wearing a black glass, everything will be black. Hence, in order to understand things as they are, it's important that we are reading them using some glass. Hence, it's always important to understand our presuppositions. For example, think of our passage in Hebrews 12. You read about suffering. You read about the fatherhood of God and His discipline and all that, and ask yourself. So, in this issue, what is it that I bring to the table that I believe is true? What is my presupposition, for example? For example, the idea that every suffering is good might be a presupposition. For example, for you that suffering is good, that might be a presupposition, or suffering is evil, suffering is something to be avoided, that might be a presupposition for you. So I'm not asking you to shelf your presupposition, but I'm asking you to understand it, to know that it is there. For example, it could be a theological presupposition. So understanding that presupposition, understanding that it is there, is really important ማለት ነው. So once you understand that presupposition, it becomes a conscious belief. And once it's a conscious belief, you can then examine it, you can then interrogate it. You can let the text affect it, for example. Hence, it's extremely important to understand that every one of us has presuppositions. So of us, for example, who grew up with an extended family, with a collective community, we have a very different presupposition than a person who grew up alone. And those of us, for example, with Western training, with Western education, we will have a very different presupposition than a person who doesn't have that exposure. So it's always good to understand that we are individuals and we have our own presuppositions. So our presuppositions, for example, might be theological. We might, for example, for most of us, we approach the text as an authoritative word of God, right? That's a presupposition. When we read the Bible, we believe we are reading God's word. That's a presupposition. We believe in revelation, we believe in faith, we believe in the doctrine of inspiration and all that. Those things are presuppositions that, for example, affect the way we read the Bible. Since we read it as the biblical word of God, for example, we read it with extra carefulness and we read it assuming that everything in it is something to be obeyed, right? That's a presupposition. Hence, we need to be conscious of our presuppositions. So there are methods in this approach, in reader-centered approach, that you should be at least aware of. For example, there is something called autobiographical criticism. In this way of reading the Bible, the reader is encouraged to include their personal experience in the text that one is trying to read. Hence, the reader's social location, the reader's gender, the reader's race, ethnicity, geography, all these things become important. Hence, the reader will try to identify himself or herself in the text. And in a way, they are not only reading the text, but they are in a way reading themselves as well. Hence, doing this, it's like asking, to read a text from your own perspective. You're not trying to be objective. You're not trying to try to reach to the author's intention and all that. You're just simply trying to read it from your perspective. We call this autobiographical criticism. And a form of it is what we call feminist criticism, for example. Feminists, for example, they have a way of reading the Bible in which they start from feminist presuppositions. So they don't try to interrogate their presuppositions, but they actually start from them, and they follow. So it's not a single thing. It's like a spectrum, as I've said. But they try, for example, to see how some of them, for example, try to see how there is a patriarchal power structure in the text itself and how it oppresses women, for example, and they will try to liberate the women of the Bible, for example, and all that. But things like this, these are not the only examples. There is, for example, what's called African reading of the Bible, African criticism, liberation criticism, and all these things, post-colonial criticism. So what makes them, what's a common denominator in all of them is that the reader is very important in meaning formation. As I've said, this is a spectrum. Some overemphasize, some take a very radical approach in which the reader's presupposition is not there to be investigated or to be interrogated, but it is there, in fact, to elucidate a meaning out of the text. But that's a spectrum. But there is also a very modest approach in which they try to integrate the reader's role in the overall process of hermeneutics. So this is called feminist hermeneutics. If you are interested, explore them, especially try to explore African hermeneutics and post-colonial hermeneutics and all that. So the third element of it is this: the reader is important in meaning formation. So it's enough if we say this much about reader-centered approach for today. Now let's actually proceed to exegesis. That is what we mean by exegesis, and how should we implement the kind of things we've been talking about so far. That's what exegesis is. Exegesis pretty much is the practical application of hermeneutics. Sometimes people use them interchangeably, and some of the books I've recommended might use them interchangeably. So that's okay. But technically speaking, they're quite different. Hermeneutics is the science of exegesis. If you remember, when we start our discussion, we defined hermeneutics as the science and the art of interpretation, right? There is the science and art of interpretation. The actual process of implementing that, the actual process of trying to understand a certain biblical text is what we call exegesis. Hence, when you hear the word hermeneutics, think of the science, think of the art, but when you hear exegesis, think of the practical aspect of it, the actual process of it. So let's try to start. We will talk about the basics today. That is, the basics of exegesis, that is best practices or best the foundational aspect of exegesis, and we will try to specialize that when we talk about each genre. For example, we'll talk, I mean, the Bible has a different literary forms, and each form has its own rules, but there are also common rules that we should be aware of, and we will try and cover that today ማለት ነው. Before that, feel free to ask questions if you have questions about reader-centered approach. Just to summarize, እያልን ያለ ነው መጽሐፍ ቅዱስን ስተረጉም ሶስት ነገሮች ናቸው ኢንቮልቭድ የሚሆኑ ጥሩ መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ ተርጓሚ ለመሆን ከፈለጋችሁ ኮንሽስ መሆን ያለባችሁ ሶስት ኤሌመንቶች አሉ። የመጀመሪያው ጸሐፊውና የጻፈበት ዓለም ነው። ስለዚህ የጸሐፊው ሲጽፍ ጸሐፊው በምን አይነት ዓለም ውስጥ ይኖር ነበር፣ ከጸሐፊው ዓለም ምንድነው የምንማረው፣ ሂስቶሪካል ኮንቴክስት ያለው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ጸሐፊውንና የጸሐፊውን ዓለም አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ በጣም ኢምፖርታንት ነው። አሴም ታይም ደግሞ ጽሁፉን ቴክስቱን እና የቴክስቱን ዓለም አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ ማተር ያደርጋል። የቴክስቱ አይነት ምንድነው፣ የቴክስቱ ዣንራ ምንድነው፣ ቴክስቱ ጋር አረፍተ ነገሮች ከአረፍተ ነገሮች ጋር ያላቸው ሪሌሽንሽፕ ምንድነው፣ የቴክስቱ ፓሴጅ ከፓሴጅ ጋር ያለው ሪሌሽንሽፕ ምንድነው፣ ጸሐፊው በጊዜው የነበረውን የስነ ጽሁፋዊ የአጻፍ ስልት ተከትሎ ስለሚጽፍ እነዛን ለመረዳት መሞከር ማለት ነው። ቴክስቱን ለመረዳት መሞከር ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እሱን መረዳት ያስፈልጋል። ስለዚህ ባክግራውንድ ሂስቶሪካል ባክግራውንዱ ብቻ ሳይሆን ሊትራሪ የሆነውንም አስፔክት መረዳት ያስፈልጋል። የቴክስቱን ስትራክቸር ኤንድ ኦል ዛት አት ሴም ታይም ደግሞ ጸሐፊውንም አንባቢውን መረዳት ያስፈልጋል፣ ወይም ራሳችሁ መረዳት ደግሞ ያስፈልጋል ማለት ነው። አንደኛ ሁሌ ለአፕሊኬሽን እሱ ማተር ስለሚያደርግ ማለት ነው። ቴክስቱን የምትረዱበት መንገድ እናንተ በምታዩበት መሰራት እንደደረግ አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ አለባችሁ። ስለዚህ ለምሳሌ በጣም የተማረ ሰው ለምሳሌ በጣም በትምህርት የሄደ ሰው እና እውቀትን በጣም ቫልዩ የሚያደርግ ሰው ለምሳሌ በዛ መልኩ ቴክስት ሊያነብ እንደሚችል ኮንሽስ መሆን አለበት። ነገሮችን የሚያነቧቸውን ነገሮች ልክ እንደ ሳይንቲፊክ ኤክስፐሪመንት ሊያደርጋቸው እንደሚችል፣ ነገሮችን ኦቨር ኢንተሌክቹዋላይዝ የማድረግ ቴንደንሲ ሊኖረው እንደሚችል፣ ኦቨር ራሽናላይዝ የማድረግ ቴንደንሲ ሊኖረው እንደሚችል ማሰብ አለበት። ሴቶች የሆኑ አንባቢዎች የራሳቸውን ኤክስፒሪየንስ የራሳቸውን ካልቸራል ማትሪክስ ሊያስገቡበት እንደሚችል ወደ ቦታው አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ ያስፈልጋል። ወንዶች የሆነን የራሳችንን ነገር ይዘን እንደምንመጣ ማሰብ ያስፈልጋል። ስለዚህ በሱ ኢንፍሉዌንስ እንዳንደረግ እኛ በምናይበት መነጽር ሚኒንጉን ሉዝ እንዳናደርገው ወይም ጸሐፊው ሊል የፈለገው ነገር ሉዝ እንዳናደርገው መነጽራችንን መረዳት ያስፈልጋል። ለምሳሌ if you know for example that you have a tendency to over intellectualize everything, be conscious of that and try to stop yourself from over intellectualizing ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ እናንተ በጣም ካሪዝማቲክ የሆነ ፔንቴኮስታል የሆነ ኤሌመንት ካላችሁ ሁሉን ነገር ፎር ናው ለአሁን የምትፈልግ እንደዚህ አይነት ቴንደንሲ እንዳላችሁ ካወቃችሁ አዌር ኦፍ ዛት አንዳንዱ ነገር እንደዛ ላይሆን እንደሚችል ሪኮግናይዝ ማድረግ ያስፈልጋል ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ ያለፋችሁበት ህይወት የተማራችሁ ትምህርት ነገሮችን እንድታዩ የሚያደርጉባችሁ መነጽር ስላለ እሱን አንደርስታንድ ለማድረግ መሞከር ያስፈልጋል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ በተለይ አፕላይ ስታደርጉ ቴክስቶችን ወደ አፕሊኬሽን ስታመጡ ለራሳችሁ ህይወት ከዛ ለስብከትም ለምንም ወደ ኮንግሪጌሽን ሌቭል ስታመጡት የኮንግሪጌሽኑ ፕሪሰፖዚሽን ምን እንደሆነ ኮንግሪጌሽኑ ከምን አንግል ሊያየው እንደሚችል ይሄ ቴክስት ሲነበብ ኢትዮጵያኖች ልናይበት የምንችለው ፐርስፔክቲቭ ምንድን ነው ለምሳሌ። ስለዚህ እሱን እንዴት ነው ፊልተር አውት ማድረግ የምችለው፣ እሱን እንዴት ነው አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ የምችለው ብላችሁ መጠየቅ አለባችሁ ማለት ነው። ቅድም እንዳልኳችሁ ለምሳሌ አንዳንድ ጊዜ እንትን ካላችሁ ለምሳሌ በጣም አሟችሁ ከዋላችሁ ወይም ደግሞ በጣም የጤናችሁ ጉዳይ እያሳሰባችሁ ከዋላችሁ ሰው የሚያወራው ነገር ሁሉ ስለ እናንተ ጤና ይመስላችኋል አይደለ? እናንተ ልባችሁ ያለበት ቦታ የምትሰሙበት መንገድ አፌክት ስለሚያደርገው ማለት ነው። ወይም ደግሞ እያሰባችሁ ሰው ስለሌላ ነገር እያወራችሁ እናንተ እያሰባችሁት የነበረው ነገር ስለሌላ ነገር ስለነበረ በዛ መልኩ ተረድታችሁ እንደዚህ ማለት ነው እንዴ ብላችሁ ታስተካክላላችኋል አንዳንዴ። ልክ እንደዛ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ቴክስቱንም ስናነብ የራሳችን መነጽር እንዳለ መረዳት ያስፈልጋል። ስለዚህ ያ መነጽር ምንችለውን ያህል ንጹህ እንዲሆን ያለ ማጣመም እንዳያሳየን ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ በጣም ኢንዲቪዥዋሊስቲክ የሆነ ለምሳሌ መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ በጣም ኮሌክቲቪስት የሆነ የጋራ እግዚአብሔር ህዝብ ፎከስድ የሆነ አፕሮች አለው። የእግዚአብሔር ተስፋ አለ ከኢንዲቪዥዋል ተስፋ ከመሆኑ በፊት የህዝብ ተስፋ ነው። መዳን ለምሳሌ ኮሚዩናል አስፔክት አለው። እንደዚህ እኛ ዘመናዊ ሰዎች ግን ሞር ኤንድ ሞር ኢንዲቪዥዋሊስቲክ እየሆንን ሂደናል። ስለዚህ የምናነበውን ቴክስት ኢንዲቪዥዋላይዝ የማድረግ ቴንደንሲ ያለን ብዙ ጊዜ። ስለዚህ እሱን ኮንሽስ መሆን ለምሳሌ ቴክስቱ ስለ ግለሰብ እያወራ ነው ወይስ ስለ ህብረት ስለ ኮንግሬጌሽን እያወራ ነው? ለምሳሌ እኛ ብዙ የኢትዮጵያ ኤቫንጀሊካሊዝም ፔንቴኮስታል ነው እንደምታውቁት። ስለዚህ ፔንቴኮስታል ያልሆነ ዲኖሚኔሽን ውስጥ ብትሆኑ ያው በፕራክቲስ ፔንቴኮስታል ናል ኦልሞስት ሁላችንም። ስለዚህ እንደዚህ አይነት ቴንደንሲ እንዳለ መረዳት ለምሳሌ ስለዚህ ለምሳሌ እግዚአብሔር ለህይወቴ አሁን በዚህ ጥቅስ እንደዚህ እየተናገረኝ ነው የሚል ቴንደንሲ አለ። ለምሳሌ ሁሉም ነገር ፐርሰናሊ ከመውሰድ ለኔ ከሚል ከመውሰድ ሰፋ አድርጎ ማሰብ ለምሳሌ አንዳንድ ነገሮች መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ እንደሆነ ሪያላይዝ ማድረግ የእኛ ቴንደንሲ ሁሌ ለግላችን መውሰድ እንደሆነ ሪያላይዝ ማድረግ። ስለዚህ ካወቃችሁት ትጠነቅቃላችሁ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ፕሪሰፖዚሽንስ ኦፍን ታይምስ ሁሌ አብረውን ነው የሚኖሩት፣ ግን ማወቅ እንድንጠነቀቅ ያደርገናል። ለምሳሌ ግራ እጃችሁ ደካማ እንደሆነ ካወቃችሁ ለምሳሌ ኮንሽስ ትሆናላችሁ አይደል? ግራ እጃችሁን በጣም አትጠቀሙበትም። ስለዚህ ግራ እጃችሁን እኮ አውጥታችሁ አጥሉትም፣ እዛው ነው ፈንክሽን አለው፣ ግን ድካሙን አውቃችሁለታል። ስለዚህ ራሳችሁን አንደርስታንድ አድርጋችሁ እንደዛ ቴክስቱን በዛ መልኩ አቢዩዝ እንዳታደርጉት መጠንቀቅ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እሱን አስፔክት ነው ሪደር ሴንተርድ አፕሮች የምንለው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እነዚህ ቲዎሬቲካል አስፔክት ናቸው፣ ኮንሴፕቹዋል አስፔክት ናቸው። የእነዚህ ቲዎሪ ኢምፕሊመንት የሚደረግበትን መንገድ አክቹዋሊ ወደ ወረቀት ስናወርደው ነው ኤክሰጀሲስ ብለን የምንጠራው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ሄጎማይ ከሚል ከግሪክ ቨርብ ነው የመጣው ኤክሰጀሲስ የሚለው ቃል። This means to lead ማለት ነው። to lead something out of somewhere ማለት ነው። ኤክስ የሚለው ቃል in Greek ሁሌ it means out, right? Think of the word Exodus, for example. Exodus says is coming out of Egypt, right? To excommunicate someone, for example, is if you say you are going to excommunicate someone from your church, you're saying that you are going to drive him out of your church, right? X is always out. Exorcise ማድረግ ለምሳሌ ኤክሰርሳይዚንግ ዲመን ምናምን ስንል ሰይጣንን ማውጣት አይደለ? so X is out. ኤክሰጀሲስም ላይ the X is out. it really is trying to say to lead out the meaning out of something ማለት ነው። ኤክሰጀሲስ means it is to dig out meaning ማለት ነው። hence exegesis is the actual process of carefully and analytically studying biblical passages, and we do that in order to reach to meaning, in order to provide a workable interpretation. Sometimes it's called close reading of a passage, exegesis. Sometimes it's called close reading of the passage. It means to pay attention to pay very careful attention to words, to the meaning of words, to phrases, to structure of a text, to clauses, to phrases, and all that ማለት ነው። Hence it really is to study and to actually closely investigate a biblical passage. That's what exegesis is. So it's the actual implementation of hermeneutics ማለት ነው። The way we understand hermeneutics significantly affects how we exegete. So you will investigate that more when you study advanced hermeneutics. So it's to investigate, it's to closely read a passage ማለት ነው። Really, if you give a very simple explanation to exegete or to do exegesis is to ask questions. To ask questions of the passage, not just to simply ask whatever question you want to ask, but is to ask good questions. A good exegete is one who knows how to ask good questions of the text. So an exegesis, when you think of exegesis, think of asking good questions. You have to be careful that these questions arise out of the text itself. So you have to be sure that the questions you are asking, that they arise out of the text you're studying. If you bring your own questions which are radically out of the context of the passage you're studying, you will start misinterpreting the text itself. An exegete is one who knows how to form questions from the passage itself. So it's to read the text and to form questions that stand out from the text itself. So it's important to understand this concept. Oftentimes we misunderstand a biblical passage. We interpret it in a way we want to interpret it because the questions we bring to it are completely foreign to the passage itself. So, for example, most doctrinal polemical discussions sometimes mistreat biblical passages because they bring modern questions. They bring questions that has little to do with the biblical passage, and they try to bring out answers from them, and that's wrong. It's important to learn to ask questions that are relevant to the passage you're reading ማለት ነው. So learn to ask questions. So when you do verse by verse analysis, for example, what you are trying to do is you are asking questions. Those questions could be grammatical questions, for example. That question could be, how is this verse, for example, grammatically related with the previous verse? It could be a question of language, for example. It could be, what is the meaning of this word? It could be a literary question, for example. What is the role of this passage here, for example? That's a literary question. It could be a historical question, for example. You may ask, how does this question, what is the historical background that I should know to understand this biblical passage first? Yes, ask questions, but make sure to ask questions that are relevant to the biblical passage you're reading ማለት ነው. So depending on the questions you ask, there are tools that you can employ in order to reach to answers ማለት ነው. The first one is, for example, grammatical criticism. If you have questions, if you raise questions about grammar, you will employ grammatical criticism and answer that question ማለት ነው. So grammatical criticism deals with questions relating to the language of the text. So if you, for example, raise question about the tense of the verb that's there that's present in the text you're reading, you will employ grammatical criticism. Hence, depending on the question you ask, there are tools that you can employ to get to the answer ማለት ነው. Hence, grammatical analysis, grammatical criticism ትጠቀማላችሁ ማለት ነው. So what's important is that not only that you raise questions, but you also know where to look for answers to those questions. For example, if you are raising grammatical questions and if you try to do historical criticism, for example, you will miss it, right? So ask questions and know where to find the answers to those questions ማለት ነው. And for grammatical questions, you can employ grammatical criticism. And you might, for example, raise historical questions. And if your questions are historical, you will employ historical criticism ማለት ነው. And there are tools that can help you answer those questions. So when for example, when we talk about grammatical criticism and trying to understand the answer, there are tools. And those tools are, for example, they could be consulting lexicons, for example. Lexicons, they will give you, for example, meaning, word meanings. And there are also commentaries, very exegetical commentaries in which they give you answers to grammatical questions, for example. Hence, raise important questions and know where to look for the answers to those questions ማለት ነው. So historical criticism, for example, if you raise historical questions, go and look for answers in historical criticism ማለት ነው. I believe I've told you about biblical backgrounds and encyclopedias and all, right? So if the question you've raised is historical, go and consult encyclopedias, go and consult Bible dictionaries, go and consult background information. If necessary, go and consult primary resources. Hence, depending on the kind of question you're raising, there are tools that you should employ ማለት ነው. Hence, to be a good exegete, to do exegesis, raise proper kind of questions, ask right kind of questions, and go and look for the answers in the right place ማለት ነው። ትክክለኛ ጥያቄውን አንሱ፣ ከዛ በኋላ መልሱን ደግሞ ትክክለኛ ቦታ ላይ መፈለግ ማለት ነው። And for example, if you raise literary questions, go and look for answers in literary criticism ማለት ነው። if you raise questions of form, go and look for answers in form criticism ማለት ነው. As I've said, there are tools, there are resources that help you answer these questions ማለት ነው. For example, if the question you're raising is associated with structure, associated with the literary position of a certain passage, the question you're raising is literary in its nature, and you should do literary criticism ማለት ነው. So to sum up, exegesis is to ask questions, to ask the right kind of questions. Those questions should arise from the text itself. So do not ask a question that is not remotely related with the passage. It's like, for example, I'm talking about hermeneutics, I'm talking about exegesis today, and if one of you, for example, raised your hand and asked me a question about the doctrine of God, for example, it simply would be out of place, right? That's not the right kind of question to ask in this course. The same is true when it comes to the biblical passages as well. Ask them questions that they can answer, that they were written to answer. Most of the questions we ask are not designed to be answered by the biblical passages correctly. So you have to differentiate between what the Bible can directly answer, what a biblical exegesis can answer, and what theology can answer, okay? Some of the questions might be theological, and hence your study of theology might give you an answer to that. But the biblical passages, there you have to understand there is a difference between exegesis and theology. So ask questions that are related with the passage itself, that the questions should arise out of the passage itself, okay? I want to highlight that. What makes you a good exegete, and what makes you, for example, a good preacher, and what makes you a preacher with theological training is that you know to ask questions that are directly related with the passage itself. So you should learn to ask good questions that arise from the passage itself ማለት ነው. So this is the foundational aspect of it. So we will talk about, for example, understanding Old Testament law, understanding New Testament epistles, and the different genres in the Bible. And we will talk about different roles based on the genres, but even then, you should understand the foundation is to ask good questions, okay? So what we are talking about today is the basics. They are true always. These concepts, these rules, you should apply them always ማለት ነው. Another basic aspect of exegesis is what we call contextual analysis. It's what we call contextual analysis. A text without a context is a pretext ይባላል። ከአውድ ውጭ የሆነ ቴክስት፣ ከአውድ ውጭ የሆነ ጽሁፍ ሰበብ ነው እንደማለት ነው። የፈለጋችሁትን ለማድረግ ሰበብ ነው እንደማለት ነው። And this is true. Exegesis always start from understanding the context. Out is important. Context is king in exegesis. Every passage exists within a context. Although we have a tendency to atomize texts, although we read texts in chunks, in portions, it's always important to understand that those chunks exist within a broad context. For example, in order to understand what I've been saying for the past 2 minutes, it's important to understand what I've been saying from the start of the session, right? It's important to understand what I will say next as well. So in order to understand what I'm saying today, the passage, the sentence I'm saying right now is directly related to what I've already said, and it's also related with what I'm going to say. Hence, context matters. Context simply is the surrounding material of the text you are interested in. It's not the actual text to be exegeted, but it's the surrounding material ማለት ነው. Sometimes it could be internal context, that is literary context. Sometimes it could be external context. It's what we call historical context ማለት ነው. Yes, you have to understand context. Contextual analysis is a foundational aspect of exegesis. So this is true if you are, whether you are reading Old Testament law, this is true whether you are reading Old Testament wisdom literature, this is true whether you're reading Old Testament Psalms, or if you're reading Apocalypse in the New Testament, or if you're reading the Gospels and Acts. So context matters always. So you have to always remember that contextual analysis is a foundational aspect of exegetical analysis. two areas are especially important. The first one is what we call historical context, and the second one is what we call literary context. We've talked about historical context when we talk about when we talk about when we talked about author-centered approach, but let me just remind you. A text is a historical phenomenon, as I've said. A text is a product of its world because it's a product of an author. Hence, it's extremely important to understand the cultural, linguistic, and political aspects that gave birth to that text. Hence, the best reading of any text is informed by its historical context. That is why it is important to understand the date, the place, the audience, authorship of a text, because those texts are a product of their history. Historical context matters. So whenever you try to understand the text, try to ask historical questions. For example, when you try to understand Hebrews 12, when you are trying to perform exegesis on it, ask historical questions. For example, it talks about the issue of discipline, right? For example, okay, how does discipline look like in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world? It was not the same as it's today, right? For example, it talks about suffering. How was suffering seen in the ancient world? It talks about sonship and fatherhood. Okay, how was the concept of sonship and fatherhood understood in that time, in the time that it was written? Because we don't understand sonship in the way that the writer to the Hebrews understood sonship, right? We don't understand suffering. For example, we live in the modern world, right? We live post in the world, in the modern world, where
Postmodernism. So, right?
yes, live in the postmodern world, and we live in the post medical revolution world, where, for example, we've managed to minimize suffering. But for the biblical writers, suffering was more real than it is to us. For example, suffering was democratized in a way. Both the rich and the poor, they had they experienced a wide variety of suffering. They health issues were rampant. Poverty was way more rampant than ours, and political instability and wars, they were more vivid. So understanding how they saw suffering is extremely important to understand that biblical passage. And the relationship between, for example, a father and a son is radically different from the relationship we understand it to be now. It's radically different how fatherhood and sonship functioned back then and how it functions now. Yes, we need to understand those concepts historically, in their own historical context. For example, it talks about when the Hebrews talks about a father discipling his son. It is clear that it's not speaking about giving a son a timeout or something like we do, right? For example, how do you fathers, for those of you who are fathers, how do you discipline yourself, your sons now? So the liberal of you might choose, for example, to give him timeout or something, or to take his iPad or his electronics away from him. That's discipline for us in the modern world, right? But back then, things didn't work like that, right? So what exactly does author mean when it talks about discipline in its own time, in its own time? Hence, we need to understand the historical context. That's why it's important to date these passages. The reason we try to give of Mark or the dating of Matthew or Romans is that the date they were written is important because that date gives us a framework to work in, right? If they are dated in the AD 50s or 60s, for example, the historical backdrop is the 50s and the 60s, right? That's That's why it's important. That's why for example, if you consult commentaries, you will see them spending a whole lot of words trying to debate when a biblical passage should be dated, right? The reason that's important is that that time, that date, will reflect the historical phenomenon we expect from that text. For example, the best example I like to give is the word مدمر, for example. The word مدمر has a radical meaning post 2010 and pre 2010, right? If you read a text that was written before 2010, the word مدمر maybe has a mathematical meaning or some sample meaning, right? ለምሳሌ በ2010 የተጻፈ ጽሁፍ መደመር እጠላለሁ የሚል ብታዩ you will give it no political weight, right? But if it was written post 2010, that statement has a radical meaning, right? That's why the date matters. That's why we try to understand the date, and the same is true for the biblical period as well. For example, the reason most scholars debate about, for example, think of your passage in Hebrews. For example, there is a debate about the dating of Hebrews, and some prefer to date it post AD 70, and some prefer to date it pre AD 70, right? AD 70 is important, as you know it. AD 70 is when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. It's important if you date it pre 70 and post 70. For example, if you choose to date the epistle to the Hebrews post AD 70, you might understand the polemics against temple rituals as a way of trying to fill the gaps that was created by the destruction of the temple, right? So it matters. That's why the date matters, anyways. That's why you should try to date your a book you are interested in as much as possible. The same is true about place. As I've given you an example last week, it matters where, for example, if you read something written about peace and stability, and if that thing is written in the Scandinavian countries, in Sweden or in Finland, or if it's written in war-torn countries like Ukraine or Gaza, the meaning will have radical difference, right? The weight you will give to it will have radical difference. That's why it's important to understand where a certain passage was written. That's why, for example, you will see discussions about the place where the epistle to the Hebrews was written. Some say Jerusalem, some say Rome. I mean, that's not mere speculation, or that's not scholars trying wasting their praise. It's important where you date it. It will give you the backdrop. It will give you the background in which you understand a certain passage. For example, if you're reading when you are trying to exegete Hebrews 12, and if you put it in Rome, if you believe that the community lived in Rome, the primary background in which you understand the issue of discipline, the issue of suffering will be a Roman backdrop, right? Because those people lived in Rome, and hence they would act in a way that fitted their context, right? So the place matters. That's why scholars try to understand where the author wrote from and where the recipients lived. Hence, historical context matters ማለት ነው. So I believe we've discussed this so far. I mean, last week or the week before, but you can find historical information. So if you are raising historical questions, you should go and look for the answers in the Bible backgrounds, in encyclopedias, and in Bible dictionaries, and all that ማለት ነው. For example, just to give you an example to convince you that historical context matters, for example, think of the issue of head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11. In 1 Corinthians 11, for example, Paul prohibits women from showing their hairs, right? They should cover their hair. They should cover their head. Why? For example, is this a case in your church, for example? I don't believe it is, right? I remember a time where this was the case when I was a young boy. I remember that, for example, women that were in a choir will have to wear head coverings, right, before they stood up on the platform and all that. But that's not the case, for example, today, right? We don't really see this being applied in our churches today. Why is that? Are we disobeying Paul? Are we disobeying the Bible? What do you think? Okay, let's start with, does your church, for example, enforce this prohibition? For example, ሴቶች ቤተክርስቲያን ውስጥ ጸጉራቸውን ይሸፍናሉ ወይ እናንተ ጋር? ያው ድሮም መድረክ ላይ ሲወጡ ብቻ ነበር አፕላይ የሚደረገው እኔም ሳስታውስ፣ ግን በአጠቃላይ ያው ጳውሎስ እንደዛ ብሎ አይወስነውም፣ ግን በጋዘሪንግ ውስጥ ነው የሚለው። ስለዚህ ቸርቻችሁ ውስጥ ለምሳሌ ይሄ አፕላይ ይደረጋሉ፣ ሴቶች ጸጉራቸውን ይሸፍናሉ ወይ? እንደዛም ያደርጋል። በር ላይ ቆሞ ጸጉሯን ያልሸፈነች ሴት እንዳትገባም ያደርጋል ለምሳሌ። ዝምታ ሆነ ጸጥታ የሚለውን መዝሙር እንክፈት ወይ? Okay, anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that this prohibition makes sense in its own historical context. In the context Paul was writing in, it was quite offensive for a woman to show her hair. It was seen as a sexual invitation. It was seen as being improper, being immodest, right? But the historical context we live in is quite different from the historical context Paul wrote in. Hence the issue at hand, the issue Paul is concerned about is being modest, right? Is living in the norm of the time, is respecting the norm of the community and all that. So in that way, this text still applies in a way that women should be modest in a way they dressed in the church, but that modesty is defined by the historical context they are living in, right? For example, there are, Christians in primitive societies in which, for example, women might go to church naked, right? So understanding the historical context and in which Paul wrote is important to understand how we should apply it today ማለት ነው። I think of, for example, Matthew 5, in which Jesus says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. አንድ ምዕራፍ እንደሄድላችሁ ግድ ቢላችሁ ሁለት ሂዱለት የሚለው ክፍል ማለት ነው። So the historical context behind this is that Roman soldiers, they had a mandate to ask anyone to carry their weight and go 1 mile for them. Hence Jesus in fact is saying something radical. He's telling the crowd to go above and beyond for the oppressor, for the Roman soldiers. So this kind of historical context helps us to understand the weight of what's trying to be communicated ማለት ነው። And think of, for example, Luke 10, in which the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the weight of the parable becomes evident only if we understand that the Jews and the Samaritans were historical enemies, right? Understanding that dynamics is the only way to understand the full weight of what's trying being communicated ማለት ነው። I believe I've given you Revelation 3 as an example the other week, so think of Revelation 3 as well. Hence, it's extremely important to understand the historical context during exegesis ማለት ነው። So remember this whenever you are trying to read the Bible. This is always applicable, whether you are reading it for your own devotion, whether you are reading it to preach, or whether you are reading it for an academic purpose. It's extremely important to understand context. So as I've said, historical context, to investigate historical context means to identify the author. So the reason it's important to understand the author is not to simply give a name or to simply label a passage just to say someone has written it. What's important is that we are trying to understand the author in his own older time. We are trying to have a profile of the author. So it's not simply to say Paul has written it, but what does it mean that it is Paul that has written it? We know, for example, that Paul is a Jew, a conservative Jew, right? that he had a rabbinic tradition, that he considers himself to be an apostle to the Gentiles and all that, right? The reason it's important to understand the author is that something written by Paul will have a different weight than, for example, something written by Peter, for example. For example, anyways, whenever, for example, when you study Hebrews 12, for example, and if you tell me this is written by Paul, you should show me why that's important. The purpose is not just to put some name on it, to label it. The purpose is that to show that the reason that specific author wrote it has a meaning, an implication on its meaning. For example, if you read something written by an Ethiopian, or let's not use Ethiopia as an example, but okay, think of the previous example about peace, for example. If you read something written by a Palestinian about peace, and if you read something written by a European about peace, it will have a different meaning, right? So the reason we try to understand the author is that to identify that perspective the author brings. For example, it's important if that author is a Jew or a Gentile in the New Testament, for example. It's important because that means a different set of beliefs. That means a different worldview, right? So that's why understanding authorship matters. And the same is true for recipients, for example. We often try to, for example, when you investigate Hebrews, you will find discussions that are the recipients Jewish or are they Gentile, for example. The reason that's important is that because understanding the recipients will it will give us a perspective to read it from. ለማን እንደተጻፈ ማወቅ ይረዳናል እንዴት ማንበብ እንዳለብን። For example, if it was written about if we know that it was written for Jews, and for example, if the author tries to explain some essentially Jewish things to them, for example, if he, for example, encourages them to worship God alone, for example, and if we know that it was written for a Jewish audience, that's a very, very, very significant thing, because the implication is that even though these people are Jews, they are involved in idolatry and all that. But if it's written, for example, for a Gentile audience, and if the author exhorts them about worshiping God alone, it would make much more sense, because we know that the Gentiles had an idolatrous background. So understanding the reason it's important to understand the recipient is to understand the text better. It's not, the purpose is not simply to answer a set of questions. It's not to say this was written by someone and for this and all that. You should exegete it in a way that reflects these facts ማለት ነው. And the same is true about provenance, that is where it was written. We've already covered that. So where to look for historical context? I believe we've also discussed this a couple of weeks ago, but just to remind you, the first place to look is the text itself. The text itself gives you historical clues, historical context. You can find, for example, implicit references to dates, to name of kings and all that. That will give you where to the time frame, right? The first one to look for historical context is within the text itself. So read the text and tries to find any historical clues that you can find. And the second one is to consult Bible dictionaries, backgrounds, commentaries. I believe we've covered this already. And if necessary, go back to the primary sources themselves as well ማለት ነው. And the second important context is the literary context. The literary context, this aspect of exegesis tries to understand the implication of the place where a passage appears in. So the literary context means, think of the example, for example, I've given you earlier. In order to understand what I'm talking about today, it's extremely important that one understand what we've discussed so far, starting from class 1, right? Anyone who understands those class sessions is best fitted to understand today's discussion, right? The same is true for biblical passages as well. In order to understand what is being said in, for example, chapter 12 of a certain book, it's extremely important that you understand what has been said so far. It's important to understand chapter 11. It's important to understand chapter 10. To understand everything that has been said starting from chapter 1. Not only what's been said so far, but it's also important to understand what's being said next as well. So books of the Bible are like a river, and they bring different things from where they've been. So chapter 12 of, for example, Hebrews is not an isolated chapter. It's intrinsically related with chapter 11 and with chapter 13. This is true about a certain passage you're reading, for example, a certain verse you're reading. Verse 2, verse 3 of some book is intrinsically related with the previous verse. So you have to understand the literary context. You need to understand that biblical books were written to be written as a whole. They were not divided in chapters or in verses like we find them today. They are a whole, they are organic. Hence, we need to understand them better. We need to understand the whole in order to understand the part. We need to understand the whole in order to understand the part. Or we shouldn't miss the forest for the trees, as the saying goes. So this is what literary context tries to do. It tries to understand why a certain passage is in a place where it is, and it tries to understand it within that context. So think of Matthew 7, for example. Just to give you an example, Matthew 7 says, for example, do not judge, or you too will be judged. So if you read this without its literary context, you might take it to mean that Christians should never make moral judgments. But if you see the context, that is the verses that come before it and the verses that follows it, Jesus clearly is talking about a certain type of judgment, a hypocritical judgment in which a person doesn't recognize its own flaws. So what's really being said is that we should judge humbly. We should judge self-consciously, knowing that we too are weak. It doesn't mean that we can't judge, we can't give pass moral judgment, or we can't say something is right or something is wrong. That's not what's being communicated. What's being communicated is to be hypocritical. That is to be self-righteous, not to recognize where we are at. For example, think of Matthew 18, for example. Matthew 18 says, for where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. So it's generally used to describe general Christian fellowship or worship, right? This verse we quote it whenever we, for example, gather in Bible study groups or something like that. But if you read it in context, it's talking about Christian discipline, right? The previous passage talk about a person who is not being obedient, and the passage invites us to talk to that person with another individual as well, to try to correct him, to discipline him. But if he says no, Jesus tells us that we can bound him on earth, and if we bound him on earth, he will be bound in heaven. This is also a misunderstood verse, where we use it, for example, to say that we have an authority to for example, to apply force in heaven or something like that. But that's not the context. The context is in church discipline. If someone is being unrepentant, we should talk to him with group, and if he's not willing to repent, since Jesus is with us in that fellowship, we have the authority to, for example, bind him, to excommunicate him, or to discipline him. That's the context this verse appears in. Think of 1 Corinthians 13, for example. This is the great chapter on love. So we oftentimes use it in weddings, in romantic context, and all that. But if we read it in context, chapter 2 talks about spiritual gifts, right? Chapter 2 talks about spiritual gifts. Hence, chapter 13 is talking about using spiritual gifts in love. The love that is being discussed is a love that should exist in ministry, in church, in the way we use our spiritual gifts. Hence, understanding the literary context helps us from misunderstanding the passage. So even when this doesn't mean that we shouldn't, and this is true even when we try to study chunks of scripture or exegetical units or certain portion from scripture, we should be conscious of how we follow that exegetical unit. So we will talk about this next week, but we should be conscious of where we divide up our passage itself. So the best way to read in literary context is, first one is to read the entire book in one sitting. It really is problematic to, this is true especially for epistles, for short books, because they were not designed to be read in, for example, in a month or so. Sometimes we take a month or two in order to finish a book, right? And that simply is problematic. We will lose all literary context when we do that. Hence, it's extremely recommended that you read an entire book in one sitting, especially those of you who are preachers of the word. You should have this habit as much as possible. The way you understand the full weight of the full message of a book is when you read it as it was supposed to be read. It was not written to be read in chapters or in portions. It was meant to be read as a whole. So you are encouraged to read it in a whole. And you should also to discern where new units start. I mean, chapter divisions, they are helpful, but they are not perfect. They don't always reflect the structural unity of the scriptures. Hence, try to understand where a certain unit should be divided up, and we will talk about this, but try to explore it as well. We'll talk about it next week. And reflect on what contribution each unit makes. For example, when you read Hebrews 12, try to read it in light of the overall purpose of the epistle to the Hebrews. For example, for this course, we have listed 6-7 objectives, right? And each class session is designed for it to contribute to that purpose in some form. Hence, identifying where each class session fits will help us realize how the course objective is going to be fulfilled, right? The same is true for the biblical passages. How does Hebrews 12, for example, fits in the overall purpose of the epistle to the Hebrews? As I've said, it's not a single unit. It's not to be treated in isolation. It was written in order to achieve the purpose of the writer of Hebrews, right? You see, we need to understand where that part fits. What is the specific contribution this passage makes to the overall purpose, the overall argument of the letter? So you need to learn to ask those kind of questions, Malitra. And you should also use tools like commentaries in order to understand the structural outline of the book, Malitra, in order to respect the literary context. So this is the basics of exegesis. You should remember this always. When we talk about Old Testament law, when we talk about Psalms, when we talk about the Gospels or the book of Revelation, these are the foundations of exegesis. These are the basics. You should always be in mind of this. Just to sum it up, you should learn to ask questions, the right kind of questions. You should know where to look for the answers. So raising questions is important, but those answers are not. You're not required to know the answers on yourself, right? For example, in our discussion, if you have questions, you ask me, right? The same is true when it comes to the Bible as well. When you have questions, learn to ask questions and learn where to ask the questions. So as I've said, if you have grammatical questions, go to lexicons. If you have historical questions and literary context, go to literary questions, go to commentaries, go to backgrounds, go to encyclopedias and all that. So it's important to ask questions, and it's also important to know where to find those answers. Other than that, do a proper contextual analysis, understand the historical context and the literary context. Do not treat the biblical passage in a very isolated manner. They shouldn't be isolated historically from the time they were written in, and they shouldn't be isolated literary from the overall book you are reading them. So these are the basics. I encourage you to understand them. If it's not clear, I encourage you to read about them, These are the foundation of exegesis, and we'll talk about the exegetical steps that you should follow ደግሞ next week ማለት ነው። If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Other than that, it's enough for today.
Actually, today, sorry. My question is it the final session for exegesis? Because I would like to know, or I would like to access the lessons concerning just how to carry out what are the basics of preparing exegetical papers and
We will do
what
that next
steps
week.
are to follow.
Next week. We'll talk about the
Okay.
steps next week. Today is the
Okay.
final class for the theoretical aspect of hermeneutics. We will not go back to the theoretical aspect of hermeneutics from now on. We will rather talk about exegesis and exegetical steps and exegetical rules, depending on the biblical genre we are studying. We will try and treat each biblical genre separately. We'll try to identify what theological considerations to have, what steps to follow, and all that. But we won't go back to the theoretical aspect of it. We will try to form exegetical steps that reflect the theory we've talked so far. We will have, I believe, we will have 9 steps or 8 steps that we should follow for your, not only for your exegetical paper, but for your personal use as well, whenever possible. And then, as I've said last time, hermeneutics is like an art planalar. It's like, I believe I've given you an example of driving a car. So till we become comfortable to it, till it becomes one nature with us, it's important to try to follow steps just to be comfortable. This doesn't mean you will always have to follow 9 or 10 or 11 steps, but it's good to follow steps, and you will, through time, you will be comfortable with it. And we will try and identify some steps. We will talk about those steps next week. Okay, as I've said, it's good. It's a good time to catch up on your reading if you haven't done till now. Try to finish reading up the theoretical aspect of what we've been saying so far. If you haven't already done that, try to do that. And then we will focus on actually trying to practice the skill of exegesis ማለት ነው. Okay, anyone else with question? Okay, Asir, do you want to pray
For me, it's
for us
clear.
maybe? Okay, Asir, can you pray for us?
Thank you for excellent class. Thank you so much, Mr. Nahom. Thank you. እንጸልይ። አባት ሆይ ስለነበረን መልካም ትምህርት ካንተ ዘንድ ስለሚፈሰው ዕውቀት የዕውቀት ብርሃን እናመሰግናለን። በጌታ በኢየሱስ ክርስቶስ ስም የተማርነውን የምንፈጽምበት አሁንም የጥበብ መንፈስ በኢየሱስ ክርስቶስ ስም እያንዳንዳችን ላይ እንዲፈስ እጸልያለሁ። Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead, Asir.
ቅዱስ አባት ሆይ አሁንም ዛሬም ነገም ቃልን የምንማረው ለመተግበር ነው፣ ለሌሎች ምሳሌ ለመሆን ነውና ወንድሜን ናሆምን ስለረዳው ሻይሎ ሴሚናሪ ስለረዳ እግዚአብሔር ሆይ የእውቀትን ማዕድ እየበላን ስለሆነ ሪሊ በጣም እየተጠቀምን ነው፣ በጣም እየተባረከን ነው። ቃል ውስጥ ያለው ምስጢር ጥልቅ ነው። እግዚአብሔር አባት ሆይ ያን የተሰወረ ጥበብ እያስተማርከን ስላለ ወንድሜ ናሆምን ስላገዝከው ሁሉንም በዚህ ሻይሎ ውስጥ ያሉትን ሁሉ ስላገዝ እናመሰግናለን። እጅግ ደስተኞች ነን። በእውነት እጅግ ደስተኞች ነን። ሪል የሆነ ናውሌጅ እያገኘን ነው። ይሄ ካንተ ነው። እግዚአብሔር አባቱ ያመሰግናለሁ። መንፈስ ቅዱስ ደግሞ ሁል ጊዜ ላንተ እውቅና እንሰጣለን። የቃሉ ባለቤት አንተ ነህ። ቃልህ ያንተ ነው። ደራሲው አንተ ነህ። ሪል አንደርስታንዲንግ የምናገኘው በአንተ እገዛ ነው። የእግዚአብሔር መንፈስ ባለንበት ብርሃን፣ የእውቀትን ብርሃን በእያንዳንዳችን እንድታበዛ እጸልያለሁ። ጤናችንን እንድጠብቅ፣ ኢኮኖሚያችንን እንድጠብቅ፣ በነገር ሁሉ የጀመርነውን ጨርሰን ለሌሎች በረከት እንድንሆን ባለንበት ቤተክርስቲያን ሁሉ የእግዚአብሔር መንፈስ እንዲጠብቀን እጸልያለሁ። በጌታ በኢየሱስም እንድትረዳን ሳምንቱን ላንተ ሰጠን። በኢየሱስ ክርስቶስም ጠብቀን። ሁላችንም በጌታ በኢየሱስ ደም የተሸፈነን እንሁን። በሰላም እስክንገናኝ ጌታ አባቱ ይጠብቀን። በኢየሱስ ስም ጸለይኩ። አሜን። Thank you so much, Nahom.
Amen. Tabarak Kasir. Have a good one, beloveds. As I have said, feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions. Have a good one.